Well, America's more than 50 years into its longest, least successful, and deadliest wars, the war on drugs. It's failed on a scale even far beyond the failures of alcohol prohibition. With overdoses now taking over 100,000 innocent American lives every year, with cartels being enriched and emboldened as never before, and with drugs and drug trading being deadlier than ever before, a re-examination of the war on drugs seems, to say the least, overdue. And this seems an especially modest demand of our politicians for one overarching reason. For over 50 years, they have ignored the caring and competent voices of one group of experts who accurately predicted exactly what a deadly disaster this would be. Studious economists, with no political hay to make and no personal advantage to enjoy, pleaded with politicians not to start down the road of drug prohibition. And then, as the years went by, certainly asked time again, please don't persist in this doomed strategy. But to no avail until now. Perhaps we should have paid more attention to the warnings of truth-tellers like former U.S. Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach. He warned that politicians had a personal interest always in pretending and perhaps in convincing themselves that they were tough enforcers. And on this topic, he added, the war on drugs is an ideal vehicle for political rhetoric. Today, one struggles to find even one politician from either of our major parties willing to ask 4 basic questions about the war on drugs. Questions so pressing they virtually ask themselves. 1, does the war on drugs actually give us more control over drugs? 2, does it actually reduce overdose deaths? 3, does it avoid creating massive new problems? And 4, does it aid drug control measures that actually work? I invite every actually concerned person to consider today the debate that caring and competent economists have tried for over 50 years to generate on these 4 questions. It appears that will have to start with private citizens, but it can be hoped they will quickly be joined by some politicians, judges, and other policymakers who will break ranks with blind adherence to a policy that, however politically beneficial to them, is a calamity for America and many other countries. So, more than 50 years in, what does the evidence show about who, between the politicians promising a drug-free America and the independent economists warning this would fail miserably and lethally, about who was right and about who we should be following today? So, does the war on drugs actually give us more control over drugs? Well, table-thumping Republicans and Democrats, candidates and office holders, have promised for decades that with the war on drugs, we would have control of drugs. They even repeatedly promised we'd have a drug-free America. The United States Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, which still shapes and commands our drug policies today, said in 1988, it is the declared policy of the United States to create a drug-free America by 1995. President Reagan, who by the way was no better or worse than politicians from either of the parties, talked up this legislation with tellingly confident language, claiming the battle has turned, he said, and we're beginning to win the crusade for a drug-free America, the kind of promise shared by Democrats and Republicans for years. And this was no passing slip of the tongue. A parade of legislative proposals and acts that were passed have carried titles with this fantastical goal. We had the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. We had the Drug-Free America Act of 1988, and I believe there was a Drug-Free America Act of 2001. We had the Drug-Free Century Act of 1999. How many of us are aware that we are now a quarter of a century into our drug-free 21st century? And we even had one act that was entitled the Western Hemisphere Drug Elimination Act that indeed by drug prohibition we would get rid of drugs not just in the United States, but in Canada and Mexico, South America. Caring and alarmed economists warned just the opposite would happen. A war on drugs would drive the drugs into a criminal underground, where, like with alcohol prohibition before, we would lose all control. And power and control, not to mention obscene profits, would lie with lawless gangs and cartels. And why would lawlessness be the hallmark of these organizations? Because without a legal market, there could be no legal regulation. And the economists warned the criminal organizations would be involved in never-ending violent wars, not just with police and civil society, but with each other. And the winners would always be the criminal organizations that were the most ruthless and the most murderous. Well, what does the evidence truly show? The war on drugs has caused us to lose control of drugs in every conceivable way, I would say. But 5 ways stand out. First, instead of having law-abiding partners like we have had with alcohol since its re-legalization in 1933, we have unregulatable providers incentivized to make drugs as cheaply, toxically, and irresponsibly as possible, and in as concentrated a form as possible. Second, as drug prohibition has driven up prices, it spawned hundreds of thousands of secret, easily erected production sites, commonly called clandestine labs, and in numbers far beyond anyone's ability to find, let alone control, over 3, 4, or 5 continents. Third, instead of the 3 completely manageable organic drugs we had in 1971 when the war on drugs was declared, that war has given us an ever-spiraling menagerie of lethal and even unknowable drugs. It seems impossible to find an economist who disagrees with the observation of Dr. Walter Williams that many of the toxic effects of prohibition are the tendency of it to increase sales and cause the use of more concentrated forms of drugs. And he mentioned, I believe, crack, cocaine, meth, and ice. Politicians even failed to look at the evidence as it came in, that the war on drugs was igniting that predictable explosion in more deadly drugs. In 1988, for example, 17 years into the so-called Nixon war on drugs, Milton Friedman pointed out, had drugs been decriminalized 17 years ago, crack would never have been invented, and there would be, today, far fewer addicts. But this warning, and more important, the accompanying warning that things were only going to get worse if this immoral policy were continued, were cast aside in favor of the political payoff of claiming a get-tough policy would work. The result? We get all those drugs named by Dr. Williams, only the list grows worse all the time. They've come to include deadly elephant tranquilizers and horse anesthetics, and now poisonous bootlegged fentanyl and other synthetics we have no way of controlling or limiting. The drugs now mutate so rapidly, they include many we don't even have names for. They even include billions of doses of look-alike tablets masquerading as either legitimate drugs or even as candy. And virtually all of them are manufactured in such unregulated, slapdash ways, their potencies are lethally unknowable, and they come with dozens, if not hundreds, of unknowable toxins. This is drug control. Fourth, just as drug prohibition has made the drugs themselves exponentially deadlier, it's made the drug trade exponentially deadlier. Somehow, with just 13 years of alcohol prohibition, America was able to realize and accept that law-abiding families like the Anheuser and Busch families and the Jim Beam Brewing Company were more reliable distributors that organized crime. But 50 years into the war on drugs, our politicians still want to pretend the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels are better distributors than a legitimate, regulated American drug industry. So drug prohibition has given us, by Dr. Friedman's calculations, at least 10,000 murders of innocents a year in America, very often of children and other bystanders to the inevitable turf wars from this terrible policy. And if there's still any doubt about the limitless upside to the violence drug prohibition creates, consider what happened when Mexico apprehended a cartel leader in 2018. In fact, El Chapo's son. A virtual war started between the cartel on the one hand and the Mexican police and military on the other. The result? The Mexican president had to order the release of this drug lord to stop the armed battles that were taking the lives of police, soldiers, and innocent civilians. And fifth and finally on the question of control, I invite everyone to consider just the recent fentanyl seizures in the United States. By all indications, the amount of drugs seized is only a drop in the bucket compared to what gets through. Yet look at just the reports of 5 recent seizures to see what control we actually don't have. 1. A single fentanyl seizure in Citrus County, Florida was enough to kill 100,000 people. 2. A single seizure in York County, South Carolina was enough to kill every member of the public in that county, or 300,000 people. 3. A seizure in San Francisco was enough to kill over 2 million people. 4. Another in Florida was enough to kill every man, woman, and child in Florida, or over 20 million people. And 5. On December 23, 2022, the California Governor's Office announced that California alone had seized enough fentanyl in just 2022 to kill the entire population of North America twice over, meaning 750 million lethal doses. And again, these are just the rare amounts that are actually intercepted. You look at these numbers and just imagine why policymakers still can't grasp what Dr. Friedman meant when he said that with prohibition, the very role of the government is to protect the cartels, because it's the prohibition alone that creates these opportunities and the staggering profits that come with them. And you can't help but imagine Dr. Friedman, if he were alive today, exhaustedly asking lawmakers again, why do you insist on being the best friends the cartels could ever have? Does the war on drugs actually reduce overdose deaths? When was the last time an American politician mentioned the difference between the 100,000 plus overdose deaths of innocents we have in America every year now to what the number was back in 1971 when the war on drugs began? That number was 6,771. In fact, if a politician were to show you, which they never seem to do, the chart of the annual overdose deaths in America over the years since the war on drugs started, one would think this chart must be reversed. The numbers, just as The Economist has predicted, have become so astronomically worse. In fact, the 1.4 million innocent Americans that have been lost to these overdoses equates with more casualties than all the war casualties in all the rest of our wars combined, going back to the Revolutionary War. Such is the success of this fantastical search for a supply-side drug answer to a demand-side drug challenge. And it might be well to recall that many of these victims are children, like our own 15-year-old grandson's friend recently lost to a fentanyl tablet that would never have existed without the war on drugs. Will even a small handful of politicians finally take the time to study how wrong they've been and be honest about it, and how even their claims of occasional victories in the war on drugs are catch-22 losses, where they suppress one drug only to see it replaced by harder drugs, or where they make a dent against one gang or cartel only to give a free run for a more violent and lawless one. I would respectfully suggest that the current unprecedented, level of carnage is proof that it's time to demand attention today to the knowledgeable and caring and selfless economists who have warned us against this. Perhaps a new generation of politicians will stand up to decline the cheap politics of prohibition and insist on the strict regulation possible only with legalization. Well, if the war on drugs has actually caused us to lose control of drugs, and it's actually caused the overdose rates to skyrocket, has it at least avoided creating serious new problems? On our website, we treat about 20 disastrous fallouts from the war on drugs. Here's a look at just some of them. First, the violence I've already mentioned, but it would be well to remember this violence goes far beyond our shores. It extends dangerously into international terror organizations, virtually all of which have funded themselves overwhelmingly by cashing in on the drug trade from our prohibition. The very reason, by the way, that one of America's staunchest opponents of the war on drugs was former Secretary of State George Shultz, interestingly a man whose background was in economics. Second, the destruction of entire sections of many of our cities, large, medium, and small, and now even rural communities. Because in all these locales, the war on drugs has incentivized lawless drug trade, making life unbearable, and certainly of no interest to legitimate companies looking for places to locate. And of course, poor and minority communities can be hit the hardest. As economist Glenn Loury has aptly described the war on drugs, it's a monstrous experiment that is grinding poor black communities to dust. Third, and maybe most tragically, this is a war on children. They're dying by the thousands every month, as no cartel is incentivized to slow down and make safe drugs, and no drug gang ever asked for proof of age before giving drugs to kids. The war on drugs has required millions of children to try to grow up and succeed in unlivable environments where violence is rampant, where many of them are drawn into dealing by experienced traffickers, and many are killed in the crossfire of drug war violence. One look at the NBC Chicago piece subtitled, "The War on Drugs Fuels Violence," should put an end to this prohibition scheme today. In one way, this was just another hand-wringing expose on gun violence killing countless children. But it stood out because of the Chicago DEA chief's statement that he was absolutely sure most of the gun deaths were part of the fight for drug turf. But never mind, these children's lives are among the many well sacrificed for this utopian vision, and this virtue signaling that goes with it. How could you write a better strategy for devastating children? Fourth, drug prohibition has never been able to avoid creating the two-tier system of justice that inevitably grows up around it. Rich and well-positioned people can imbibe and deal drugs to each other as almost a sacred right. It's a topic of open celebration at our most prestigious universities, successful companies, and even Hollywood. 3 presidents in a row had to acknowledge that as young adults they were deeply involved in drugs. Yet all 3 seemed perfectly happy to cash in on the political payoffs of posturing as tough on drugs. Washington, D.C. and our 50 state capitals are awash with office holders insisting on militarized police and imprisonment for others, but then sentimentally telling us how proud they are of their own children's courageous battles with drugs. But any of this same drug conduct indulged by poor people, especially poor people of color, will have midnight raids conducted on their apartments, militarized police units at their doors, police shootings, attack dogs unleashed on them, and of course arrests and lengthy imprisonment. Far from being able to stop the day-to-day discrimination and arrests and charging decisions, we can't even get the racism out of our laws as written on the books in the cold light of day. As just one example, Almost 40 years into the great experiment of the United States sentencing guidelines, we're still multiplying the weight of crack cocaine by 18 over the pharmaceutically identical powder cocaine most often indulged by whites, to massively over-sentence minorities. This has all the fairness and equal protection of saying blacks who are convicted of stealing will be sentenced the same as whites, except that they will have their sentences determined by multiplying by 18 the stolen proceeds in their cases. Fifth, drug prohibition does savage damage to our criminal justice system, our correction systems, and even our most precious constitutional inheritances. I'd say Dr. Jeffrey Myron highlighted this damage pretty well in pointing out that Breonna Taylor was killed by one thing: the drug war. Our courts are clogged, our prisons are overcrowded to the point that decent programming and even day-to-day safety are often completely absent. Police-citizen trust is destroyed, and police themselves are imperiled by being thrust into this immoral war. And these 5 examples of what should be regarded as intolerable unintended consequences barely scratch the surface of a full picture. The massive and outrageously expensive diseases from these poisonous drugs, including heart infections costing taxpayers over $1 million per patient to treat, HIV, hepatitis, and more, the mental illness and homelessness caused by these bizarre and contaminated prohibition drugs, the broken families, the alarming corruption of many public officials, the botched raids with deaths of both innocent citizens and police, the erosion of trust and safety between citizens and police, the risk, by the way, that the murderous cartels we've created south of our border could be enticed into for-hire terrorist attacks on America, not to mention the sheer waste of hundreds of billions of dollars in limited public funds. All this and much more would have to be considered to get a full picture of the real cost of this political fantasy. Plain and simple, the price of the war on drugs is intolerably exorbitant. Well, if, as The Economist warned, the war on drugs destroys our control over drugs, massively drives up deaths, and creates oceans of additional problems, can it at least be said that it's some kind of assistance to drug control measures that do work? Yet here the answer is the most resounding no of all. Because everything good drug control requires is crushed by the war on drugs. Here are just 6 examples among many others. 1. As politicians should have learned from the innumerable benefits of re-legalizing alcohol, actual drug control requires that we have law-abiding, tax-paying partners in the business of drugs. But of course, with drug prohibition, our partners are always going to be the gangs, cartels, and criminal conspiracies we in our utopian policies actually create and reward. And instead of being incentivized like today's alcohol companies are to comply meticulously with all laws, the incentives are all to be as violent and deadly as possible. 2. Actual drug control requires that killer drugs like meth, bootleg fentanyl, bootleg carfentanil, ice, crack, and more, again, drugs we have only because of drug prohibition, that these be regulated out of existence and replaced with the overwhelmingly safer pharmacy-grade drugs enjoyed at Ivy League colleges and country clubs. But all this regulation is impossible because of drug prohibition. 3. Actual drug control requires strict regulations against deliveries to minors or enticement of them into dealing, something vigorously promoted and rewarded with drug prohibition. 4. Actual drug control requires that we have a compassionate, evidence-based, medically informed relationship with addicts, including the millions of addicts created by prohibition. But again, drug prohibition undermines this humane approach as it condemns addicted people to be tied to criminals, poisonous drugs, and constant risk of violence. 5, actual drug control requires that we protect our police and their relationships with the public by relieving them of the impossible burden of arresting our way out of a medical problem. Again, all made impossible by drug prohibition. And 6, actual drug control requires that we have the reemergence of responsible government and the rule of law in Mexico and in South American countries being fled by entire families terrorized by the violent cartels our drug policies have created. One has to wonder if the scandalous silence from today's politicians on the topic of re-legalization and effective control isn't driven in large measure by the fear of what is sure to happen when all this is achieved by public demand. Indeed, what will be said when, with the re-legalization and strict regulation recommended by the economists, overdose, violence, and disease rates plummet, when equal protection of law and police-citizen trust quickly return, and entire neighborhoods and cities begin to restore themselves. So what defense can there possibly be for a drug policy that strips us of control and gives it to the gangs and cartels, multiplies death rates more than tenfold, adds horrendous problems, and stands steadfastly in the way of measures that would work? The only redeeming thing to say about drug prohibition is that its failures and defects are so massive and comprehensive that it makes clear the necessity of legalization and the actual regulation that is possible only then. The late United States District Judge Whitman Knapp, a rare example of a judge willing to speak the truth about the war on drugs while still on the bench, was a powerful clarifier of how the war on drugs makes no sense unless it can in fact make America drug-free. This wise and courageous member of the federal bench, appointed by President Nixon, by the way, emphasized this truth. And he did this 3 decades ago and over 1 million needlessly lost American lives ago. The story of the catastrophe of drug prohibition can rightly be classified under one heading: the failure to listen to the wise, informed, and caring economists who predicted exactly what was going to happen. Well, now that drug prohibition has been multiply exposed for what the economists said all along it was going to be, a political fantasy, where do we go? And here, despite the terrible price we continue to pay in over 300 American deaths a day, there is good news in one thing: the path forward is clear. Listen to the economists who have been correct in all things. Follow their lights to real drug control and the legalization that will end this nightmare. Our success or continued failure will depend on one thing: whether we finally follow these actual experts. And given the ongoing carnage, whether we will demand this of policymakers immediately. We can certainly demand that our politicians and candidates for office acquaint themselves with the economist's message on the need for drug legalization. By now, all fit policymakers should easily be able to grasp the wisdom of Edward Ellison, the former head of the Scotland Yard anti-drug squad, when he wrote, "I say legalize drugs because I want to see less drug abuse, not more. I say legalize drugs because I want to see the criminals put out of business." We think every politician should be asked if they now understand 2 fundamental truths from economists about where we must go from here if we care about America's best interests. First, this truth from Dr. Tom Wainwright: the failure of the war on drugs has a simple reason. governments continued to treat the drug problem as a battle to be fought, not a market to be tamed. And this second truth from Dr. Benjamin Powell: the U.S. government's policy of drug prohibition, like alcohol prohibition before it, is a failure and not one that can be corrected by a mere tweaking of current policy. Because any politician unable to grasp these truths is unqualified for office. You'll see a link on our website to our suggested steps for reaching drug prohibition repeal. And you can even submit ideas of your own. And you'll see a link called Your Powerful Voice with several things you can do today to demand the legalization and actual regulation that will take back control from the gangs and cartels supported for half a century by drug prohibition. One final thought: time is crucial. The over 300 American lives we are losing every day to drug prohibition is a pace of carnage in excess of the loss of American life during World War II. Every day matters, something we must insist our policyholders begin to take seriously.